Hey everyone, welcome to this video on client-side rendering, server-side rendering and static site generation. So if you're in web, you must be hearing all these terms and everyone's throwing them around and how web is progressing with server-side rendering and static site generation, and we will today try to understand these terms. What do they mean in their most bare bones form. We will not discuss much about a particular framework like React or Vue, though we will discuss a bit about it, a very little bit, but mostly on what do these terms mean generally. So first part, we have got this presentation. Please don't be bored. I don't want this to be a MBA classroom, but we have what we have. All right, so the difference, how are these types of methods classified? Why are these different? So the difference is only in when and where the JavaScript is executed to generate the HTML. Right, so our browsers can render nothing but HTML, but sometimes we may need data from an API or data from somewhere, and we do some computations or some data loading in JavaScript, and then we render that, then we generate the HTML and give it to a browser to render, and a browser does that job wonderfully. And this JavaScript code that I'm talking about can be in a form of some vanilla JavaScript code that we wrote, or can be in form of a JavaScript framework like React or Vue or Angular, and these concepts apply for all of them. So coming to the first thing, which is client-side rendering. And client-side rendering is what we traditionally do with these JavaScript frameworks. When we start with React, we just use create React app, and we write an application which renders everything on the client, and which means that we are generating HTML by executing the JavaScript on the user's device, and the user's device might be a phone or might be their PC, basically in their browser. So let's see the pros and cons of this approach. So the pro is that it's fresh data every time. So every time we refresh the page, the JavaScript gets executed. It loads the data from the APIs and serves it to the users. Maybe we are using some caching and we do caching incorrectly, then there won't be fresh data every time. But if you are not doing any caching, then we'll obviously get that, and if there is an error, then it will just show that the API is unreachable or something like that, and there is very little load on the server. So it makes sense when maybe we don't have a server, we are using some external API, external services directly from the client side, which is very rare. Generally, even if you're using some external APIs, we will first load the data in a server and then pass it to the client, because there will be server keys and everything. But there are some cases where we are directly using a external API. Then we don't need to manage our own servers. We can just serve all these things on on a static site hosting, on a CDN, something like that. But the big con why people are quite skeptic about this method nowadays is that we have realized that there are much wider variety of devices than we previously imagined. While someone might be using some high-end iPhone, someone else might be using some cheap low-end phone which has a very basic processor, and they are quite slow in executing and loading executing JavaScript and loading all the data. So it becomes the website just shows a blank to them, or doesn't show, just shows them loading, just shows them loading for a while. And because see, we might think that this is not a big deal, but you might think that this is just a matter of few milliseconds, but sometimes phones are so slow that it might take even in seconds, so that will severely impact the user experience, and users will leave your website, which won't be good for your business. So we are coming to server-side rendering, and see, in traditional web development, we traditionally always used server-side rendering before these JavaScript frameworks even came on. When we were writing the Java servlets with JSPs and ASPs, we obviously people still use them now, or in PHP. They're still lot in use, but yeah, in traditional web applications we made that way, or traditional websites we made that way. We always use server-side rendering. We generated all the data in the server. We loaded all the data in the server. We read from the databases. We requested an API, or we did whatever, and we generated all the HTML and we send it to the browser. So basically, in server-side rendering, we generate the HTML by executing the JavaScript on the server, and we do this every time the users request something. So every time we have a request, the program looks into the DB or looks into some API, gets the data and generates the HTML and sends it down to the browser, so the browser just renders it. But the problem is the problem is again that it might increase sometimes the performance, the round trip time. I don't mean that it increases performance, I mean it decreases the performance by increasing the round trip time, because if our server is slow or our DB is slow and we have some bottlenecks there, it will severely affect our user experience. But yeah, obviously any method we are taking, we have to do it correctly, otherwise any method won't work. But yeah, this is a problem. This happens sometimes, but this is again very good. This method is again very good for SEO, or search engine optimization. Now that I think about it, I missed it in this presentation, but yeah, client-side rendered applications using JavaScript are pretty bad for SEO. Why? Because many search engines, many robots do not execute the JavaScript on a page, so they don't know what content is on the page. So let's say we have a page on, let's say, a breed of dog, and someone searches it. The search engine bot might come to your page, but it doesn't know what is on the page. It doesn't know what breed of dog we are talking about, or we are talking about any dog or whatever. But when we're using server-side rendering, what the bot gets, or what the browser gets, is a plain HTML. And in plain HTML, it's easy to understand that we are talking about a particular breed of dog. But yeah, the modern search engines like Google, they say that they are executing JavaScript, but this kind of problem might just pop out anywhere. Even if in, like, let's say in Slack or in some Twitter or Facebook, whenever you share a link, there is a social card that shows up. And with client-side rendering, it might be very tricky to populate your data. Like, you must have seen that when you share a link in Twitter or something like that, it shows up the title of the page, some information, some picture right there in Twitter, which is engaging for the users. But when we have a client-side rendered page, if Twitter doesn't know what to show, because the content isn't ready yet, because they haven't executed the JavaScript. But when you're talking about server-side rendering, the content is there, because what the server is returning is plain HTML. I hope this makes sense, because this is quite important. That's why people are using server-side rendering now, because SEO is quite bad with SEO is quite bad with client-side rendering applications. Now we come to the final thing, the static site generation. And after this presentation ends, we will go to some samples. So stick around for that. Okay, so yeah, we generate the HTML by executing the JavaScript on the build time. So what happens, and I'm using the word server here, executing JavaScript on server, but it necessarily means any build machine. I just mean to say that I'm not just using the client's browser to execute JavaScript and render the HTML. So every time we trigger a build, every time I do, let's say, npm build, it gets the data. My JavaScript gets the data, loads all the data, and all the JavaScript is executed then and there. All this data is now stored in some HTML file, a simple HTML file, and then we can just distribute this HTML file with a static hosting. So we are getting actually the best of both worlds in a sense, with static site generation, the best of client-side rendering, that we can have files distributed without a server, with just some static site hosting, and we don't have that performance bottleneck of executing all the JavaScript in the client's machine. We just because the file contains pure HTML. Yeah, but obviously there are some problems that if you change some content, let's say, if you change even some text, the title of the page, you need to rebuild the site again. And this becomes a problem if you are updating the site quite often. Let's say Instagram, every time someone posts something, they cannot rebuild, they cannot rebuild their full site, so they cannot just use it. But if you have a blog and you are updating it once a month or once a week or even daily, the size of all the files stored will increase, but it won't be much. You can still manage, and the build times are quite less. And there's some fancy sites like Gatsby Cloud now. So they promise that if you change content, they will get it live in few seconds, few milliseconds even. So build times are getting way faster. But yeah, obviously this is not a method for some sites which have user generated content and which are being updated every second or every minute or every hour. So we cannot use it in those cases, but this is very good for blogs or landing pages or website of a company. So it's really very good for that. And there are many frameworks which support it now, like Gatsby for React. Next.js also supports a static site generation now, so we can understand that this is quite in demand, and whenever people are building a blog, they are generally using this because it's much faster in comparison to something like client-side rendering, and we can distribute it with a CDN. So as you can see, I've got these three web pages which look quite similar. They look absolutely the same, in fact. And you can see that I've got SPA, SSG, and SSR written on them. So in the SPA site, let's say I reload the page, you can see there is a bit of time which shows loading. Because it's requesting an API, and until the data is loaded, it just says loading. In SSR2, you can see that in SSR you don't see that the loading text, because the server sends the HTML as it is. It sends down the pure HTML. It does not send some JavaScript which needs to be executed in the browser, and the data needs to be loaded in the browser, which sends us everything. So there is no loading sign there. In SSG also the same, no loading sign, because it's just a HTML file that we are showing. Now let's see the code for these things. Alright, so as you can see, I've got three folders: SPA, SSG, and SSR. The code is quite simple. In SPA, what I've got is I've got a simple HTML file, simple JavaScript file. It's not using any framework or something like that, because we don't need any framework to have a single page application, or some client-side rendered application, because we can write everything in vanilla JavaScript, obviously. So yeah, I'm using vanilla JavaScript here to not be biased towards any framework. Alright, so let's see that. So we have an index.html file, and which links to this script file which loads the data and sets the text. Quite simple. We have all probably used these kinds of structures where we load data and set some in HTML. And this is it. This is it for a client-side rendered application. Now let's move to the server-side rendering one and see that how we are doing the same thing, but in a different way. So the server-side rendered application does not actually run on the browser. It runs on a Node.js server, correct? And you can see that if you know Node.js, you will understand that I'm using these libraries Express and Fetch, isomorphic fetch, which gives me ability to load data from an API in my browser. Sorry, in Node.js. And what I'm doing is every time there is a request from the user, I'm loading the data. And then generating using this function, generate HTML, and I'm generating the same HTML as you saw in this index.html file. I'm generating the same HTML with the data that we get. So basically we are generating the same content, the same HTML, but this time on the server. Sorry, am I showing you the SSG example? All right, it's the same, yeah. Yeah, we are back to the server-side rendering. Yeah, the code here is kind of the same. The generate HTML function is the same. All right, so here you can see that we are using this generate HTML function to generate the same HTML that we saw. So the content is the same, just the location, just where we are doing it has changed now. We are not doing it in the client anymore. We're doing it in the server on each request. All right, now this is the SSG, or the static site generation version. This is similar to the server side rendering version, as you saw quite evidently and quite obviously. But in server side rendering, we were doing it on each request. Here we are just doing it once and saving it in a file. So we are loading the data and then saving it in list index.html, and you can see this HTML has been generated loading the data from the API, and this is the same HTML that we were using. This actually shows us that we are actually shipping out same content, same HTML. The browser gets the same HTML every time, but just the when and where of JavaScript execution changes. So when we were having a client-side rendered application, the where was the browser. When we have a server-side rendered application, with the where is the server, and the when is each time there is a request. In static site generation, the where is a server or a build machine, and the when is just once in build time. So let's say the API changes their content. I mean that this JSON placeholder typicode.com posts ID1 returns something different now, and I don't hit build on this site, my site will still show this index.html page which will have the old content, but the new content won't show up. So every time there is a change of content from the API or any change of content, we have to rebuild the site. I think these shows us the basic principles, the basic concepts of these three widely used terms. Now, we are using JavaScript frameworks for most cases nowadays, and there are many frameworks for every kind of JavaScript frameworks. Like as I told, in the case of React, there is Next and Gatsby. Gatsby is mostly for static site generation. It's pretty great. If you are writing a blog or making some landing page for a company, not just landing page, a full site for a company, which does not need to be updated quite often, and you can absolutely use static site generation. And the thing with frameworks like Gatsby and Next.js is that you get performance out of the box. When you are making a single page application with Create React app, you have to work a bit harder to get that performance. You may get that performance, but you have to work hard for it. But in this case, you don't need to. When you're using these frameworks, in the case of React, you are getting the performance out of the box. So if you can, if you don't have a site where there is no there is user generated content, you don't have any user generated content, then just use static site generation. You might be having user generated content for which you might need SSR or an SPA. Many companies are using SSR now. Next.js is everywhere. I think Hulu uses Next.js and server-side rendering. Netflix uses it for some cases, and if you go to the Next.js website, you can see that there are many companies which are using server-side rendering with Next and React, and the same goes for Gatsby. Many companies are using it because to get that sweet performance. But it does not mean that SPA is dead. Obviously, it's very easy to just get started with it and build a site. You to create React app, you write your components, you don't need to think about anything. You just get it out there. In that sense, it's quite easy to get started with it. The learning curve is much smoother. So sometimes it makes sense to use a SPA. And again, whatever path you are choosing, you need to make sure you follow the general guidelines of building any application and give your users the best experience. All right, so that's the end of the discussion. And if you liked the video, if you learned something new, leave a like and comment whatever you liked or whatever you don't like, any suggestions that you might have, and subscribe to the channel. I need the reach, as you can see. So yeah, that's it for now. Thank you, everyone.